She was just the maid, until the night fear bowed to her courage. The story begins inside a glittering mansion where wealth drips from every corner, but dignity is not shared equally. She worked quietly in the shadows, serving drinks, clearing plates, while enduring careless whispers, dismissive glances, and blunt remarks that cut deeper than anyone realized. To them, she was invisible, a servant defined by her uniform and her skin. Yet when chaos erupted and every guest trembled, she was the one who stood tall. What happened next would leave the entire room forever changed and leave you questioning what true strength really looks like. Stay with us until the end, because this is more than a tale of danger. It's a lesson about courage, injustice, and humanity. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our newest stories, and let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The chandeliers blazed with cold white light, their crystals trembling under the hum of conversation, the air filled with the sharp scent of wine and polished silver, the echo of laughter bouncing across marble floors. Guests glided through the hall, their gowns whispering against the tiles, their voices rising in practiced elegance. Yet behind every glance lurked a quiet disdain that cut sharper than glass. She carried the weight of trays stacked with fragile crystal, each step measured, her back straight though her shoulders ached, her silence an armor against words that pierced without warning. A man with a heavy ring leaned toward another, whispering as his eyes tracked her movement. The corners of his mouth curled in amusement as he muttered that she moved like someone who had never been inside a room like this until she wore that uniform. She caught the look without turning her head, the sting lodging in her chest, yet her hands never trembled, the glasses steady, her eyes fixed forward. Another woman let her gaze linger on her skin, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she commented that she had seen women like her walking the streets downtown but never serving champagne in a mansion. The remark floated in the air, polite on the surface, cruel underneath, leaving her throat tight yet her steps unbroken. The music swelled, a violin cutting sharply through the murmur, but for her the sound carried no warmth, only a rhythm to pace her breathing as she weaved between clusters of suits and jewels. She placed a glass in the hand of a guest who did not meet her eyes, his fingers brushing hers as though by accident before he pulled away quickly, wiping his hand on his jacket. The sting of rejection was familiar, but she buried it, letting the movement of her body become mechanical, efficient, invisible. She thought of the hours spent polishing these very floors, the smell of wax clinging to her hair, the way her knees ached from scrubbing steps that none of these people noticed. They saw the shine beneath their shoes, but not the person who had bent in silence to create it. She kept moving, yet inside she measured every word, every stare, filing them away in silence, not as wounds, but as reminders. The master of the house strolled across the hall, his white suit gleaming, his smile broad as he welcomed another cluster of guests. His wife, clad in a scarlet dress, stayed close by, her laughter sharp as glass, her children clinging to the folds of her skirt. They barely looked at her, the one who had folded their clothes, who had soothed the youngest child's fevered brow in the dark, who had set their table with hands rough from endless work. She caught the little boy's eyes once, a flicker of recognition, a faint smile, before his mother pulled him close, whispering for him not to bother the help. The words sank heavy, but she kept her face still, her body steady. Every motion was practiced, every emotion locked deep behind her ribs, because weakness was a luxury she could never afford in this room. Another guest, his tie loosened and his cheeks flushed with wine, blocked her path. His laugh burst too loud, his eyes sweeping her from head to toe as though measuring a possession. He asked if she had ever dreamed of being in a place like this before, if she understood what it meant to stand beneath chandeliers instead of streetlights. His words carried the sting of mockery, but she only tilted her head, offering no answer, placing the glass of champagne into his hand before stepping around him. Her silence became her weapon, her refusal to rise to the bait her shield, though his laughter followed her across the floor like a stain. Inside her chest, her breath pressed against her ribs, not from fear, but from the steady fire of endurance. She had been underestimated before, and tonight would be no different. The room grew louder, the voices colliding, the clinking of crystal almost drowning out the quiet crack in her own thoughts. She noticed the guards stationed at the doors, their posture rigid, yet their eyes distracted by laughter and drink, and she noted the vulnerability without meaning to, her mind always measuring, always calculating. She moved past the buffet, the silver trays stacked high with food too rich to taste, and she remembered the sting of hunger that had driven her to accept this job. The weight of injustice pressed heavily, yet beneath it burned a certainty she could never abandon. Her worth was not defined by the eyes that dismissed her. She swallowed the bitterness, replacing it with the discipline she carried from a past no one here imagined, a past she never spoke of, yet it lingered in every precise step, in every refusal to let her hands shake. When the violin reached its highest note, she paused at the edge of the hall, her eyes sweeping the crowd, each jeweled smile and careless gesture etched into her mind. They laughed as if the world could never touch them, as if danger had no place in a hall so gilded, as if the woman serving them did not carry the weight of their contempt like chains around her shoulders. She shifted the tray in her hands, her wrists aching, her jaw tight, and she thought of how many times she had endured words meant to cut. Her silence was not submission, it was survival. She knew, though they did not, that silence could one day shatter, and when it did, the echo would not be ignored. The silence she carried as armor was about to be tested, for just as the violin reached its peak, the front doors slammed open with a thunderous crack, and the light fractured under the sudden echo of gunfire. The music choked mid-note, the chandeliers rattled, and screams tore through the hall as shadows rushed in, masked men brandishing weapons that gleamed under crystal light. Glass shattered, trays clattered to the floor, and the scent of champagne mixed with gunpowder, sharp and suffocating. The guests collapsed in waves, silks and jewels hitting marble, their bodies trembling as commands barked across the room. "Down, on the floor!" roared a voice, guttural and merciless, and in the chaos, the wealthy shrank into frightened shapes, their power stripped in an instant. She stood frozen for a breath. The tray gone from her hands, her mind burning with calculations, yet her heart beat steady, not with shock, but with recognition. This was not the first time she had heard men wield fear as a weapon. One of the intruders shoved a guest aside, the barrel of his gun pressed against the man's temple, his voice breaking with rage as he demanded silence. A woman in a red dress clutched her children, sobs choking her throat, begging for mercy that came only as laughter from the masked figures. The air thickened with terror, the chandelier dust falling like ash upon heads bowed low, and every sound was sharper than the last, every heartbeat like a drum in a suffocating march. She crouched, eyes sweeping the room, reading every angle, every movement, her breathing shallow but controlled. The leader's mask tilted toward her, his eyes narrowing, his voice sharp as he barked at her to get down. She did not move immediately, her body still, her thoughts a torrent of judgment and risk. Around her, the wealthy cowered, faces pale, hands trembling, but her gaze shifted to the children pressed against their mother's dress, their cries rising louder, piercing even the robber's fury. Her choice sharpened in that instant, and she stepped forward, slow, deliberate, as though cutting through air thick as stone. "Lower your gun," she said, her voice steady, though every barrel in the room now seemed to turn her way. The leader snarled, demanding silence, his weapon jerking with every syllable, yet her eyes locked on him, unwavering as she added that the children behind her would scream louder if he did not listen. The words hung, suspended, and for a flicker, hesitation cracked his command, his stance faltering as though the weight of her calm unsettled him. The wife clutched her children tighter, her plea muffled, begging her not to anger them, but she ignored the warning, standing taller, her palms open, the tremor she suppressed locked deep within her chest. The guests stared, disbelief etched across faces that had moments ago mocked her, now silenced by the sight of the maid confronting death itself. She spoke again, her words cutting sharper than the guns, telling him he shouted because he was afraid, and afraid men made mistakes, and mistakes brought blood. The room froze, the air holding its breath as his finger twitched on the trigger, yet her voice carried no fear, only certainty. The man's mask tilted closer, his gun pressing against her forehead until her skin reddened under steel, but still she did not blink. His growl broke into a hiss, demanding she repeat her words, and she did, unflinching, telling him he did not want to fire because a single bullet would summon the police to hunt him until he was caged or dead. His chest heaved, the weapon shaking, and behind him another robber muttered that she was stalling, his voice betraying unease. The leader snapped back, his command cracking with strain, and she tilted her head, telling him calmly that every second he wasted raised his risk, every moment spent screaming was a moment closer to failure. Around her, the guests trembled, their fear louder than their voices, while within her the discipline of old training pulsed like a second heartbeat. She did not reveal what she carried, but the steel of her past guided her words, shaping her defiance into a blade sharper than any weapon in the room. One robber shoved a guest to his knees, demanding jewelry, watches, and wallets, the sound of valuables clattering into a sack echoing like chains across the marble. A man fumbled, his ring slipping from nervous fingers, only to be slapped across the face by rough hands, the sound cracking through the air. Another gun pressed to the millionaire's temple, sweat dripping from his skin as he struggled with his gold watch, his words stammered pleas that fell into snarls of silence from the intruders. Yet through the chaos, her voice rose again, low and deliberate, cutting through the shouting, commanding them to stop screaming at children, telling them their violence only bred memories that would not fade. The leader snapped his mask toward her, his rage a storm barely contained. But behind him, his men shifted uneasily, the certainty of their dominance slipping as her calm eroded their control. She did not step back, did not lower her gaze, for she knew fear was their weapon, and by refusing it, she stripped them of power. Her chest rose steadily, though the world seemed to press against her ribs, her eyes never leaving the gun that threatened her life. She felt the stares of those who had dismissed her as invisible, their disbelief pressing heavier than the barrel against her skin, yet she stood as the only figure unshaken. In their silence lay a truth they could not name, that she, the one they had overlooked, was the only one unowned by fear. The leader's voice broke as he commanded his men to tie everyone up, his desperation spilling, yet before they moved, she cut him off, her tone slicing through their frenzy like a blade, telling them they could bind the adults, but they would not touch a single child. The threat in her voice was not shouted, not desperate, but cold and final, and it rooted them where they stood. For the first time, even the guests fell silent, the sobs quieting, as though the room itself bowed to her will. The room itself had bowed to her will, yet the fragile stillness trembled on the edge of collapse, for defiance could only hold back violence so long before the storm broke. The leader's hand shook against the grip, his mask hiding the flicker in his eyes, but his pride burned hotter than his fear, and with a guttural snarl, he shoved the barrel closer, demanding she kneel. She did not lower herself, her body rigid, her stare steady, the command falling against her calm like waves against stone. The children whimpered behind her, the mother's nails dug into their arms as she begged silently for mercy, and the guests held their breath, their terror tightening the air into a suffocating weight. Then, in one shattering moment, another robber lost patience, raising his weapon at a man too slow to empty his pockets, his finger curling against the trigger. She saw the motion before anyone else, and instinct surged through her like lightning. Her body moved before thought, a flash of precision born of years hidden beneath silence. She dropped low, her hand sweeping upward, slamming into the wrist that carried death, the gun clattering across marble as the sound cracked like thunder. Gasps exploded. The man staggered, his face twisting with shock, before her elbow drove into his jaw, the snap echoing against crystal walls. The leader roared, lunging at her, but she twisted, her arm hooking his wrist, her body coiling like steel as she wrenched it behind his back. The gun slipped from his hand, clattering near her feet, and she scooped it up in one fluid motion, the crowd frozen as though time itself had paused. In the space of heartbeats, the invisible maid had become the center of every eye, her stance sharp, her weapon steady, the red mark still on her forehead glowing like a brand of defiance. The third robber faltered, his weapon raised yet trembling, the barrel wavering as her gaze fixed on him with unflinching precision. She leveled the gun at his chest, her voice calm but cold, commanding him to drop it. His shoulders heaved, the weight of his mask no shield against the storm in his hands, and though silence stretched unbearable, the clatter of his weapon against marble broke it like glass. The hall erupted in whispers, a tide of disbelief sweeping across guests who had moments ago dismissed her as background noise, now staring at the woman who had turned predators into prey. The leader struggled beneath her grip, cursing with venom, but the gun pressed against the back of his head silenced him more effectively than any words. Her chest heaved, her pulse thundered, yet her face betrayed nothing, for discipline was carved into her bones. Around her, the crowd shifted, eyes wide, lips parted, the weight of realization pressing like stone upon them. The millionaire clutched his wrist, his gold watch still in his palm, his gaze fixed on her as though seeing her for the first time, his lips whispering a question he could not voice. His wife held her children tighter, tears streaking her face, her sobs quieting as if afraid to shatter the fragile balance now hanging on one woman's resolve. The guests, painted in fear and disbelief, looked at each other as though searching for explanation, yet none came. For what stood before them defied everything they thought they knew. She held the gun with a grip honed long before this mansion, her stance not of a servant, but of someone trained for war, and though she had said nothing of her past, the truth pulsed in every line of her body. The leader growled, spitting words of venom, calling her insane, claiming she would not dare pull the trigger, but his bravado rang hollow, his breath uneven, his pride broken. She leaned close, her words like ice, reminding him that he had chosen this house because he thought it easy prey, but he had forgotten that the quietest figure in a room can be the most dangerous. His body stiffened under her hold, the truth cutting deeper than any blade, his mask no longer a shield, but a cage around fear. His men exchanged nervous glances, their power drained, their dominance shattered, and the guests stared with eyes wide, their disbelief turning slowly into awe. Yet she did not bask in their gaze, for her focus never left the threat, her eyes cold, her grip steady, her every breath sharpened to survival. The room itself seemed to breathe with her, the chandeliers swaying above, the air trembling with the echo of defiance that had reshaped the night. The children, wide-eyed, clung tighter to their mother, yet their sobs softened, replaced by silent wonder as they watched the maid who stood taller than any fear. A man who had earlier sneered at her presence now sat frozen, his mouth dry, shame burning behind his eyes, the sting of his own prejudice heavier than the gun once pointed at his chest. She saw the flicker of regret in faces that had mocked her, but she did not let it sway her, for her focus was the danger still alive in the room. Her breath came steady, her mind sharp, the memory of training long buried carrying her through the storm. The truth of her strength had shattered the room's illusion of control, yet the night was not finished, for the leader writhed under her grip, cursing with every strained breath as the echo of his defeat hung in the air. The guests remained frozen, their disbelief heavy, their shame thicker still, and the children clung to their mother's dress with wide eyes that reflected both fear and wonder. Sirens rose faintly in the distance, their wail threading through the silence, and with each note the robbers' bravado crumbled further, their shoulders sagging as the weight of inevitability bore down. She pressed the muzzle against the back of the leader's head, her voice sharp and final as she ordered them all to their knees, and the command struck deeper than any threat, because for the first time they obeyed. The sound of weapons scraping against marble as they fell from trembling hands was louder than the gunshots that had opened this chaos, for it carried the collapse of power, the surrender of those who had come as predators. The millionaire stumbled upright, his suit disheveled, his eyes wide, unable to reconcile the woman before him with the maid he thought he knew. His lips parted as though to thank her, but no words emerged, the weight of humiliation silencing him, for gratitude demanded recognition of how wrong he had been. His wife clutched the children, her sobs quieter now, her gaze fixed on the woman who stood tall while men with guns had faltered, and her silence held more than awe. It carried the echo of guilt. Around them, the guests rose shakily, brushing dust from silks and jewels, yet their movements were clumsy, hesitant, because no polished manner could hide the shame pressing on their skin. They avoided her eyes, yet the flush of regret stained their faces, and in their silence lay the acknowledgment of prejudice laid bare. She saw it all, without flinching, her breath steady, her grip firm, but her thoughts were not on their shame. They were fixed on the fragile line between calm and chaos, still stretched tight across the room. The sirens grew louder, blue lights flashing against the tall windows, shadows of authority drawing closer, and the robbers groaned under the weight of fear they could not conceal. The leader tried one final time to spit defiance, his voice cracking as he called her a fraud, claiming she had no right to command them, but his words withered in the air, for no one believed them now. She answered with silence, her stare colder than any rebuke, and he shrank beneath it, his pride broken more completely than his plan. The children stared at her, their trembling softened, their small faces reflecting not just fear, but a strange sense of safety, as though her presence had built a wall no weapon could breach. One child whispered to his mother, asking if the maid was a hero, and though the mother did not answer, her tears carried the weight of that truth. The guests exchanged glances, yet no one dared speak, because words seemed too fragile to hold the enormity of what they had witnessed. The doors burst open at last, officers storming in with weapons drawn, their boots striking marble in sharp rhythm, their eyes scanning the chaos. They found not blood and ruin, but robbers lying on the floor, their hands bound by fear, their weapons scattered, and in the center stood the woman, her chest heaving but her stance unbroken, her grip on the gun unwavering. An officer demanded to know who had disarmed them, and the silence of the room broke with a hesitant voice, the millionaire's words catching in his throat as he admitted she had done it. Gasps rippled again, not from fear, but disbelief renewed. The truth impossible, yet undeniable. The officer's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to her, asking her name, his tone edged with respect that no one else had given her in this house. She lowered the weapon slowly, her breath finally loosening, and answered with a voice steady though fatigue pressed at her bones. The simple name she gave carried the weight of everything unspoken, her identity reclaimed in a room that had stripped her of dignity only hours before. The officers secured the robbers, dragging them away in chains of steel rather than fear, their curses muted by the sound of boots and the echo of justice closing in. The mansion exhaled, the heavy air lifting, though the silence remained heavy, not with danger but with reflection. Guests began to murmur, voices hushed, none daring to meet her gaze directly, for each carried their own reckoning, their prejudice exposed under the blaze of her courage. Some bowed their heads slightly, awkward gestures of respect, yet many stood mute, their shame too raw to form an apology. She saw their silence for what it was, not ingratitude, but the uncomfortable birth of recognition, and she did not press them, for her worth had never needed their approval. She turned instead to the children, her gaze softening, her body lowering as the smallest one clutched her apron, eyes wide with innocence, untouched by the cruelty of the world. The boy's voice was small, almost a whisper, as he asked if she had truly not been afraid, his words carrying the weight of every soul in the room. For the first time since the chaos began, she let a faint smile touch her lips, her reply quiet yet resolute. She admitted she had been afraid, that fear was real and heavy, but she chose not to let it rule her, and that choice was what courage meant. The boy's eyes widened, his grip tightening, and his face lit with something purer than awe. It was hope. Around them, the room listened, the silence no longer suffocating but reflective, the message sinking deeper than any lecture could have. She rose slowly, her strength tempered by weariness, her eyes sweeping the room one last time, her stance still proud, her dignity unshaken. The officers guided her toward the door, yet the millionaire stepped forward, his voice trembling as he tried to thank her, his words breaking under the weight of shame. She glanced at him once, her gaze steady but unreadable, and told him simply not to thank her, only to remember that courage does not come from wealth, but from refusing to let fear win. He lowered his eyes, his throat tight, and in his silence lay more truth than any speech. The guests parted, allowing her to pass, their silence heavy with realization, their eyes following her not as a servant but as the one who had carried them all through the storm. Outside, the sirens faded into the distance, the night air cool against her skin, and for the first time she allowed herself a deep breath, her chest easing, though her spirit still burned strong. She walked into the darkness, not as the woman they had dismissed, but as the figure who had rewritten the night, leaving behind a truth no one in that mansion would ever forget. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful story of fear, courage, and dignity. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of this journey spoke to you the most? Share your reflections in the comments below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. If you found meaning in this story, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. Until then, take care, stay strong, and we'll see you in the next episode.